Section 3. Before the buyer says yes. Fees, intent to proceed, and the 7-day rule. They want my credit card. Should I pay this? Emily and Carlos have now received their loan estimate. Carlos reviews the document that evening. Emily has questions about the estimated payment, so she sends Jason, their lender, an email asking for clarification. The next morning, Sarah gets a text from Emily. Jason's office is asking us to move forward with the loan. They also mentioned ordering the appraisal. Can they charge us now? That's where our TRID story gets more interesting. The loan estimate isn't simply a piece of paper the lender sends because federal law likes paperwork. The timing of that disclosure connects to important consumer protections involving when certain fees may be imposed. Give the consumer a chance to look first. Imagine the alternative. You apply for a mortgage, and before receiving meaningful information about the proposed loan, you're immediately charged hundreds of dollars in application, appraisal, processing, or other fees. Now you've spent money before having a meaningful opportunity to review the proposed transaction. TRID addresses that problem. Under 12 CFR Section 1026-19E2I, a creditor or other person generally may not impose a fee on the consumer in connection with the application before the consumer has received the loan estimate and indicated an intent to proceed with the transaction. There is an important limited exception involving a bona fide and reasonable fee for obtaining the consumer's credit report. So when Emily asks, "Can they charge us now?" Sarah shouldn't guess. She should understand enough to recognize that the timing of the loan estimate and Emily and Carlos's intent to proceed matter. What does intent to proceed mean? Carlos reads his loan estimate and says, "Okay, this looks like the lender we want to use. Let's move forward." That's the basic concept. After receiving the loan estimate, the consumer may communicate an intent to proceed with the transaction. Here's something agents should understand. An intent to proceed does not necessarily mean the buyer has signed some universal federal form titled Intent to Proceed. Depending on the creditor's process, the consumer's communication may occur in different ways permitted by the rule, and the creditor must document that communication. For Sarah, the important lesson isn't learning the lender's internal documentation system. It's understanding the sequence. Application, loan estimate, consumer review, intent to proceed. Then the mortgage process continues. Don't confuse the purchase contract with intent to proceed. Here's where agents sometimes mix two completely different transactions. Emily and Carlos already signed a purchase contract for the Gilbert house. Does that automatically mean they have communicated their intent to proceed with Jason's particular mortgage transaction? Those are separate issues. The purchase contract establishes obligations between the parties to the real estate transaction. The intent to proceed relates to the consumer moving forward with the creditor's mortgage transaction after receiving the loan estimate. Sarah should not treat the buyer's signature on the purchase contract as a substitute for the lender's TRID process. Another protection: don't hold the loan estimate hostage. TRID also addresses another potential problem. Imagine Jason says, "I'll give you the loan estimate after you send me your tax returns, bank statements, W-2s, and every other verification document I want." That creates a problem under the rule. A creditor generally cannot condition providing the loan estimate on the consumer first submitting documents verifying the information provided with the application. Remember what we learned in Section 2. Once the creditor receives the 6 pieces of information constituting an application, the loan estimate requirements are triggered. The lender may certainly need extensive documentation later for underwriting, but the disclosure itself cannot simply be withheld until the consumer produces all verification documents the creditor wants. The 7 business day rule. Now let's add another piece to our timeline. Regulation Z generally requires the creditor to deliver or place the loan estimate in the mail at least 7 business days before consummation. Why? Again, think consumer protection. The idea is that a consumer shouldn't receive initial mortgage information and immediately be pushed into consummating the transaction without meaningful time to consider it. This is where Sarah needs to pay attention. Suppose Emily and Carlos write an extremely aggressive closing date into their purchase contract. Sarah might think, the seller agreed, so we're good. Not necessarily. A purchase contract doesn't erase federal mortgage requirements. What is consummation? You're going to hear the word consummation throughout TRID. Agents sometimes casually substitute closing, signing, funding, and recording as though all of those terms mean exactly the same thing. They don't. For Regulation Z purposes, consummation occurs when the consumer becomes contractually obligated on the credit transaction, as determined under applicable law. That's an important distinction. TRID timing requirements are tied to consummation, not simply whatever date an agent casually calls closing day. This is why Sarah should coordinate with the lender and escrow professionals rather than independently calculating federal compliance deadlines. The Friday closing problem. Let's return to Emily and Carlos. Suppose the purchase contract requires a very fast closing. Emily receives her loan estimate and immediately tells Sarah, "We don't care about waiting periods. We already bought the house. Tell Jason we want to sign tomorrow." Sarah should recognize a problem. The buyer and seller agreeing to a short contract period doesn't automatically eliminate federal disclosure timing requirements. There are limited circumstances under Regulation Z involving a consumer waiver or modification of certain waiting periods for a bona fide personal financial emergency. But that is not something Sarah should casually recommend just because everyone wants a faster closing. Wanting the keys sooner isn't automatically a bona fide personal financial emergency. Broker tip: work backward from closing. Experienced agents don't wait till 2 days before closing to start asking whether the loan timeline works. When you receive an accepted contract, communicate with the lender early. Does the lender have the application? Has the loan estimate been issued? Has the buyer indicated an intent to proceed? Are there any disclosure or underwriting timing concerns that could affect the contractual closing date? Sarah doesn't have to calculate Jason's federal deadlines, but she should ask enough questions to recognize a potential problem before the sellers have a moving truck sitting in the driveway. Emily and Carlos have received their loan estimate and told Jason they want to proceed. Now comes another question buyers asked all the time. If this is an estimate, how much can these numbers actually change? That's where TRID becomes even more important. And that's where we're headed in Section 4. Online Discussion 1. Emily receives her loan estimate, but has not yet indicated that she wants to proceed. Why does that matter before certain fees are imposed? Regulation Z generally prohibits a creditor or other person from imposing fees on the consumer in connection with the application before the consumer has received the loan estimate and indicated an intent to proceed. A limited exception exists for a bona fide and reasonable fee for obtaining the consumer's credit report. This protection gives consumers an opportunity to review important proposed loan information before becoming financially invested through additional fees. 2. Carlos signed the Arizona purchase contract 3 days ago. Does that automatically establish his intent to proceed with Jason's mortgage transaction? Answer: no. The purchase contract and the mortgage transaction are separate. Signing the real estate purchase contract establishes contractual obligations relating to the property transaction, while the TRID intent to proceed concerns the consumer's decision to move forward with the creditor's mortgage transaction after receiving the loan estimate. The agent should avoid confusing these separate processes. 3. The seller accepts a very short closing period, but the lender says federal disclosure timing may prevent the buyer from consummating the loan that quickly. What should the buyer's agent do? Answer: the agent should not assume that the contractual closing date overrides federal mortgage disclosure requirements. The agent should promptly communicate with the lender, buyer, escrow professionals, and broker as appropriate to determine how the issue affects the transaction. If contractual deadlines may need to change, the party should address those issues through the appropriate contractual process rather than expecting the lender to disregard federal requirements.